Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
So if you're hearing this on the day it's released, it is Election Day. And with that, we've got a lot to talk about when it comes to how this election could reshape New Mexico politics.
And there's also a chance you're listening after Election 2. If that's the case, yes, there will be some races that'll be decided. To timestamp ourselves, we are recording this episode ahead of Election Day because on the day itself, on November 5th, it's an all-hands-on-deck day for us in the newsroom. But we hope this conversation can illuminate more on what the races have been about and what these candidates may bring into office.
So without further ado, let's bring our guest in this week. He's a wealth of knowledge as a professional pollster, a longtime political science professor at UNM, and also a longtime political analyst for KRQE. That is Gabe Sanchez joining us here. Gabe, thanks for being here once again.
Oh, always a pleasure to talk with y'all and talk a little bit about New Mexico politics. So a lot to cover, I know. I always appreciate y'all giving me a lot of time to break some of these things down. And hopefully we'll have a lot of great content for folks as they approach Election Day.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Gabe, obviously this is a presidential election year, which usually means higher local voter turnout at the polls. We've had a lot happen nationally and locally. Assassination attempts, a presidential candidate stepping aside months before the election. Those are just two big ones. Considering all that's gone on, just high level, what word would you use to describe this 2024 election season?
Wow, pick one word. I'd probably say contentious. I mean, you think of the stakes, presidential election, post-redistricting for us in New Mexico, a lot of different avenues to pursue in terms of how New Mexican voters are approaching the election, but obviously not just at the top of the ticket where contentious is probably the right way to frame the presidential race, but across some of the congressional district races, even some of the local races. I think the tension and the contentiousness is just a reflection of how competitive some of these races are, both nationally and here in New Mexico. And I think that's part of the overall context is usually when we see competitive races, greater enthusiasm from voters, we expect higher turnout. And I think that's part of the context, which for us, when we think about the positives of democracy, seeing high enthusiasm and turnout is always a positive.
All right, still keeping that big picture view, but zooming in locally, how should we be looking at this election landscape in New Mexico? Is this an exciting or competitive election for federal races, state races, local races?
Well, it's an important thing to consider, right? What do we trust in terms of the polling numbers? What do we make of the early turnout numbers, et cetera? Big picture, let's start with the presidential. Obviously huge. We're talking about a race that might be decided by thousands of votes. When you think about how many people will cast a ballot in a presidential election across the country, to say it might come down to a few thousand votes tells you just how close this is. All polling across the country, ours included, has this essentially within the margin of error in every key battleground state. And overall, thinking about just the overall national, polling numbers, we're seeing a very, very tight race. Thing to translate is, right, in New Mexico, at least if you look at the most recent polling, it looks like a pretty comfortable lead for Harris, somewhere between 13 percentage points across most of the polls that are taking place here in New Mexico. So on one hand, you say, it looks like it's probably going to be in range for what we saw in the last presidential election cycle, Biden winning by about 10 percentage points. However, right, you have to ask yourself, why would former President Trump be visiting New Mexico if he did not see a different reality in the state? He's consistently said, going all the way back to his first presidential run, he always saw New Mexico as in play for him. I think the state's demographics on the border, et cetera, gives his team probably a little bit of a different angle where he perceives maybe he can make this tighter, even pull out the state. So I think for Republicans out there who are listening, they see Journal Poll, for example, having Harris as a comfortable lead. They have to be thinking, we must have a chance in the state, right, to be able to pull this out, at least make it much more competitive and interesting than a lot of the pre-election polls are suggesting. And I think that's part of the context for how we think about all the down ballot races. If the Trump campaign sees this as tighter for them, obviously Republicans down the ballot have to be thinking there's got to be something in play for them that makes some of these races that we might just look at his face as pretty comfortable leads for Democrats, maybe a little bit tighter than what we're seeing in the polling numbers. And I think that's part of the interesting context that we want to break down for viewers.
Yeah, and let's start with one of those big local races in terms of the money being spent on advertising. That's the U.S. Senate race. Democrat Martin Heinrich is looking for a third straight Senate term, and he's facing Republican Nella Domenici, whose father was the last Republican senator for New Mexico in D.C. How has this race shaped up? It sounds like, some of the polling out there indicates it has been an uphill battle for Domenici.
Yeah, I would say, like, on its face, right, any candidate, Domenici being just one of potential Republicans to be able to take a shot at Heinrich, was going to face an uphill battle. I mean, the polling has him trending even a little bit better than Harris. And you just think about Heinrich's status as the senior senator from the state of New Mexico. And for viewers in New Mexico, we know that matters, right? We've had long-term history of senators who have maintained long status as incumbents, have essentially been somewhat of the spokesperson for New Mexico politics. And I think the fact that Heinrich has kind of stepped into that lane and handled it very well made him a very, strong candidate that would have a difficult time for any Republican really doing better than what we're seeing in the context of Domenici being able to step in as a challenger. So with all of that headwind, if you want to think about it for Heinrich, he's an incumbent, has huge wealth of resources, hasn't really made any missteps or gaffes in his time in the Senate. And, he carries that mantle of the long tenured Senate reality we've had in the state. I think it would be dang near impossible for any Republican, to be honest, to be able to pull out victory. So I think a big part of what Domenici is trying to do is to show that she could outpace the top of the ticket race. And for a lot of these candidates, remember, your first run, you might not be expected to be able to pull out a big overall, what I would call as a huge upset. So largely what you're trying to do is show that you've got name recognition, which she somewhat inherits, obviously, from her family name. But if she can show that, look, I'm competitive and I can actually outpace the top of the ticket and be able to do a little bit better than former President Trump, that would be a win for her. And I think that's probably what her side is looking at as we look down the stretch. Can she outperform what Trump does at the top of the ticket? I really don't see this as a race that's going to come down to a really tight, performance from Republicans. I really would expect Heinrich to be able to pull this out by double digits, just like what the polling is suggesting he should.
Interesting. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the feelings people have about Pete Domenici here. Nella's father, Senator Pete Domenici, who was a revered figure in New Mexico. He served in the Senate for over 3 decades. Do you think the namesake, though, has worked for or against, or has it been just a neutral factor for Nella Domenici?
I think it definitely helps. I mean, you earn the nickname of Saint Domenici, essentially, right? We just have to think about how powerful and impactful that man was in the context of New Mexico politics, right? Over 3 decades of not only serving the state well, but essentially being a national figure politically, and all of that reflected on New Mexico politics. Obviously, that helps, right? But name recognition is something that candidates often try to buy their way into with campaign ads, a lot of other things. She had a bit of that already coming into the race, but that only goes so far, right? At some level, you've got to prove to New Mexico voters who you are, what you bring to the table, that can overcome a really powerful incumbent that, again, has done essentially everything you would ask a senator to do in the context of New Mexico politics. So I think it definitely helped, probably has got her to a point of being able to run for this and raise the money necessary to be competitive. But that only goes so far, and I think that's what you're seeing right now is where the race stands as we're looking into it a few days away from voting day.
At these two candidates' most recent debate, Nella Domenici brought up speculation that we have discussed here on the podcast with the man himself, Senator Heinrich. She brought up the speculation that he may be interested in running for governor. She argued that if Heinrich becomes governor, he then gets to appoint his replacement. And some believe that if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, Governor Michelle Luhan Grisham could potentially be appointed to a Harris cabinet position, for instance, leaving a vacancy in the governor's office. So when we asked Senator Heinrich about this on the podcast, he said he was interested in serving New Mexico as best as he can. And right now that is in the Senate. What is your take? Could that be a path for Senator Heinrich to become Governor Heinrich?
Well, absolutely, right? And I'm sure you all are hearing the same rumor mills I hear on the street in New Mexico all the time, that Heinrich, potentially would give up his Senate seat, run for governor. We do know that if he decides to make that decision, he would be the front runner, in my opinion, regardless of who else enters the race, to be honest, in either the Democratic or Republican side. I think he's that strong as a candidate statewide that if you wanted to run for governor, again, first day, I'd say, hey, he's the front runner, and I would expect him to win that race unless he makes a significant misstep. So I think obviously that avenue is there for him. You know, I've got to take him like everybody else on his word that, you know, he's interested in remaining in the Senate. Obviously things might change, and, you know, the governor's on her last term, so that makes it obviously a viable position for anybody to be thinking about. So, you know, you take him on his face value, but it's wise, I think, for Domenici to raise that as a concern, because obviously she's got to make up some ground if you trust the polls. And one way of doing that is saying, look, you've got a candidate who's potentially thinking about another seat as governor and not thinking about Senate. So I think that is something that I would do if I was her. You want to raise some speculation, maybe open up some avenues to be able to break into his lead. But as long as he's saying, you know, I'm interested in remaining in the Senate and serving New Mexico, we've got to take him on his face for that. But at the end of the day, you know, we're in the business of speculating and talking about what might happen. So if you think about that domino effect, right, you're thinking about some major players in New Mexico that might be making moves if the governor, assuming that Harris wins. Obviously, this is going to come down to, as we noted, a few thousand votes. I would not bank on a Harris victory, but if she does win, obviously our governor has strong relationships, you know, with the vice president. I think the fact that she's got a lot of credibility, particularly in a lot of areas in public policy like healthcare, makes her viable for, you know, a great opportunity to serve at the cabinet level for the vice president. And that's something that obviously would have spillover effects for a lot of people saying, hey, if the governor's stepping aside, maybe this opens up the door to think about governorship earlier than you might as well. So a lot of domino effects might happen. Right now, I think Heinrich has a very comfortable lead, is probably going to win re-election for his Senate seat, and he'll have to make some big decisions on whether or not he feels he can serve New Mexico better in that role as a senior senator or better as a potential governor in the state of New Mexico. And only him and his internal team know, you know, when he looks in the mirror in the morning, how does he feel he can serve the state better? He's obviously got a family, so a lot of it is, would he like to spend more time in the state versus traveling back and forth? All of those things obviously will break down as we get past this election cycle. But right now, I think he's got a commanding lead on the Senate, and he'll probably end up having another opportunity to remain in the Senate. If you ask me, what would I prefer? I think New Mexico's always benefited from having a long-term, powerful person in that Senate position, and that's him at the moment. So I'd like to see him, you know, stay within that role. But if things change and he decides that he wants to run for governor, as I noted, he'd probably be the front runner against anybody, Democratic or Republican side in that race.
That's one thing the senator did mention in our interview on the podcast here was the idea of what seniority gets you in the Senate. It's certainly nothing to just walk away from. So there is that consideration.
Yeah, just know you're rewarded for seniority. And so what that means is, you know, his opportunity to maintain and probably secure even more stronger committee assignments where you're able to do things like we're talking about former Senator Domenici, bring a lot of resources right back to the state of New Mexico. So I think there's a lot of value in having somebody with longevity in the Senate, but obviously he's got to look in the mirror and decide what he wants to do longer term.
Yeah. Let's move to what's probably the closest watched federal race this election, even outside of New Mexico. That is the race in the House between Democrat Gabe Sanchez and Republican Yvette Harrell in Congressional District 2. This is a rematch, the mostly southern New Mexico district. It now also, after redistricting, it represents parts of the South Valley and the west side of Albuquerque, which tends to lean more Democratic. Vasquez is the incumbent. He won this in 2022. The seat has traded parties, though, in each of the last 3 elections. How close is this race? Is it still part of the national watch list of close races in the House?
Yeah, this is the race, in my opinion. This is what will keep us up late on election night, talking about whether we can call the race, because I do perceive it's going to be very close. Right now, some context for folks, right? We think about this as one of the hot must-watch congressional districts, not just in New Mexico, but obviously nationally now. But for a long period of time, we're talking about over 40 years, this was a pretty safe Republican seat, was essentially in recent memory like the seat where you would expect Republicans to have some congressional representation as the northern districts started to trend more democratically safe. So you had that context. Then obviously more recently it's gone back and forth with these two candidates essentially trading places in the last couple of election cycles to hold the seat. So it's, you know, long-term memory, pretty safe Republican seat now is thought of as one of the key toss-ups. How close is it? It's a great question, Chris. If you listen to the polling, most recent poll from the Albuquerque Journal suggests that Vasquez has a 4% lead. That's a little bit stronger than, 2022 when he won by 1,500 votes, right? So it's a question of whether or not it'll be a barn burner again, within 2,000 votes, or if the polling suggests it could be a 4 or 5% victory for Vasquez. My view on this is it's probably within 3 or 4% for Vasquez. That's where I think it's at now. I think it's a little bit more comfortable for position for him than he saw in 2022, largely because of redistricting. If you think about some of the podcasts where we've talked about this race before, I remember noting that if redistricting was going to have an impact, it would show up strong for Vasquez during the presidential race, much more so than the off-year 2022 cycle. And the reason for that is we know turnout is always going to be higher in New Mexico in a presidential year. A lot of voters who pay enough attention in off-year election cycles, but not quite enough to actually register and turn out to vote. Presidential races, right, are driven by the top of the ticket. There's a lot of folks who are very interested in casting a ballot at the top of the ticket who will probably cast a ballot at this down ballot race as well. All of that I felt would be an area where Vasquez would benefit from, because a lot of the younger voters, folks that aren't as well informed only in presidential years, those folks tend to trend Democrat. So I thought as this race move to a presidential cycle, Vasquez would benefit from that. That's why I think it might be a little bit more comfortable victory for him. But at the same time, we know having former President Trump on the ballot turns out voters, particularly in southeastern New Mexico, which are Harrow voters. So she's got to feel, hey, if what we've seen in the past, particularly 2020, where Republicans outperformed polling, she's got to feel like, hey, I'm in a very comfortable position within a few percentage points in most polls. She probably feels she can squeak this out.
And you mentioned the maps. This is the first year that we've implemented the redistricting maps for this race, correct?
For a presidential.
For the presidential.
2022 had these maps in play. So it's not the first time these two candidates will feel the effects of redistricting, but I've always noted redistricting, if it was going to have an impact on this race, it would be now in 24.
Yeah, and to talk about that a little bit more, do you see that giving an advantage to one side, just giving more Democratic control in Congressional District 2 long-term? Do you see it having long-term effects?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a reason Republicans sued, for these maps. They felt that it would pose a disadvantage for them, particularly in this district. It's nothing new. I mean, I was involved as an expert witness going all the way back to 2010, trying to redistrict this, potential district to bring in more Hispanic voters, essentially. And that's essentially what happened. For viewers at home, if you didn't pay close attention to the shift in the redistricting maps, essentially now this district moves all the way into the South Valley of Albuquerque and brings in a lot more Hispanic voters into this district. Really important context, right? Hispanic voters in New Mexico tend to move towards Democrats. But if you look closely at the Albuquerque Journal poll for the presidential race, they were projecting that, Trump might get as high as 41% of the Hispanic voting base. That's a really important number, because Republican strategists will always tell you if they hit 40% among Hispanic voters, not only nationally, but in states like New Mexico, they feel that bodes very well for them. So Harrell must look at it and say, hey, sure, redistricting is bringing in more Hispanic voters, but let's not assume they're all going to bode well for Vasquez and Democrats. So that's, I think, the context in which we want to think about this race. Obviously, long-term, I always felt like this would benefit Democrats in this district. But in this particular race, with former President Trump on the ballot, and if we believe Republicans can get anywhere near 40%, this makes this a bit tighter than you might imagine for the Vasquez-Harrell race.
Got it.
So there are two other congressional districts up for grabs, and ones that we certainly are not going to spend quite as much time on for reasons we'll get to, I think. But let's start with the Albuquerque-centric seat, CD1. This is a race between Democrat Melanie Stansberry, who's looking for another term. She's facing Republican Steve Jones, who's run for office once before as a write-in candidate. This race, along with almost every other one in CD1 for the last maybe 2 decades now, it doesn't feel close. But that is just from a very, I think, cursory point of view, where you can say there really hasn't been a whole heck of a lot of advertising on this. When you see more advertising, it gets more competitive. What is it with this race? What are you seeing? It doesn't feel close, but am I off base here?
No, I think you're dead on. Of all the races we could talk about, this one probably feels the most safe for Democrats. I think Stansbury in the latest round of polling is doing the best of all federal Democratic congressional candidates, even statewide candidates. I think she's polling the best. And I think a lot of this is the underlying trends in the district. I remember once upon a time, right, we'd be talking about this as one of the key swing states. Right? I remember this is a Heather Wilson seat once upon a time. So this was one of those flips that went back and forth between Democrats and Republicans for a long period of time. Two trends have worked against Republicans being competitive in this district. One is underlying demographics, right? More people have moved into the urban area. This is the urban district, if you want to think about it that way, in New Mexico. Urban districts tend to move towards Democrats nationally as well as here in New Mexico. So some of those underlying demographics have benefited, Stansbury just being in this district. And the other one obviously is redistricting. It didn't change a whole lot. It maybe, we thought maybe would bring more Republican voters because you're losing some of those down to CD2, but it just really hasn't really translated into Republicans perceiving that they have a big opportunity in this district. That's why you haven't seen a lot of money invested, not as much campaign advertising. Partly that's on the Democratic side because Stansbury looks at it and says, I feel safe. I don't need to spend a lot of my money. And Republicans, you have a difficult time raising that amount of money when potential investors, potential PACs and all of that look at the landscape and don't see a great opportunity to pick up a seat in this congressional district. So I think this is probably the safest for Democrats. I would not expect this to be a close race that we'll be talking deep into the night on election night.
So there's also Congressional District 3 that is up north mostly, changed after redistricting as well. It's only gone to a Republican once since it was created. That was Bill Redmond in the 90s who won a special election. This time around in this race, it's incumbent Democrat Teresa Leger Fernandez. She is facing Republican Sharon Kloster-Chilich, who's a former state lawmaker. Same thing, though. This race doesn't feel close, even though you are seeing at least a candidate in this race who has been elected to office before.
Yeah, you actually have a candidate with experience on the Republican side, some name recognition. But this is, as you noted, historically been the safest Democratic seat in the state, right? It would be rare to see Republicans being able to squeak out a victory, and it would be a major upset. So I think that's the context in which we operate. You look at the candidates after that. You say, okay, underlying context advantages Democrats. Is there something that, might be a misstep from the Democratic incumbent? And I don't see that with Leger Fernandez. She's done a really solid job from all accounts in Congress. There's not a lot of vulnerability. There's not a lot of things that open up a window to be able to really attack her on. And consequently, she's, I think in the latest polling, 52% is where she's coming in at. Candidates in pre-election polls, they're always looking to hit the magic number of 50%. You feel if you're a candidate on either side and you've got 50% or higher, you're where you need to be as you head into election. At 52%, I think that's a pretty comfortable margin for her. And again, you just don't see a whole lot of windows of opportunity for there to be maybe a big major national push towards Republicans, things of that nature that would make this more interesting. And none of that has really, moved into the northern area of the state. So I think, Leger Fernandez is sitting in a pretty comfortable place. Obviously, crazy things can happen a week out of an election to make this a bit tighter. But I expect Leger Fernandez to retain her seat as the incumbent. And I don't see anything, in the tea leaves that suggests that she's got anything major to worry about.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
I want to briefly jump into the presidential race. It's been relatively quiet on the presidential campaign trail here in New Mexico until this moment. As we record this, President Trump is now planning to hold a rally in Albuquerque on Halloween, but the Harris campaign has not put any main campaigners out here in the metro area in this hastened race since Biden dropped out. So what is in it in the strategy for Trump to stop in Albuquerque, an area that's historically gone to Democrats, as we noted? And why do you think the Harris campaign hasn't had more of a concerted effort here?
Yeah, that's a great question and a lot to unpack there, right? It's always exciting for us when you've got a presidential candidate making a stop in New Mexico. I remember, I'm old enough at this point in my career to remember when that was normal in New Mexico. You all probably remember this. We'd see multiple visits from presidential candidates and or their surrogates. These days, as most national political experts see New Mexico as a pretty safe state, at least on presidential races for Democrats, we don't see that level of activity, right? I mean, thinking back, it was 2019 where former President Trump made a stop in New Mexico. That was a big deal. I see this also as a big deal for Republicans that Trump is going to make a visit on Halloween in New Mexico. Unpacking that's a little challenging, primarily because former President Trump has not really followed mainstream strategy as he approaches this election cycle. And what I mean by that is usually, right, you see presidential candidates like Harris is doing only focus the last week of an election cycle on states that they perceive are in play and very tight for them. So mostly in battleground states. That means out west, thinking about Nevada and Arizona, less so New Mexico. And I think you see that from, the Harris campaign. I don't anticipate either Harris or her vice presidential nominee making a stop in New Mexico because they probably perceive their time is more well served in the key battleground states out here out west. That's probably going to mean stops in definitely Arizona, maybe Nevada. So what's a little bit different from former President Trump is he's focused not so much on that traditional get out, into some key states and really focus on what we often refer to as the quote unquote ground game in politics. He's really focused on making stops in states, including New York, right? Where a lot of us would say, why be in New York? You don't really have a chance to pull in that state. That's a pretty safe Democratic state, right? But I think what he's doing is trying to rally his base by showing up in states where he knows he's going to get a big audience behind him, have a lot of opportunities for a lot of voters in other states to just see him with a big backdrop of enthusiastic supporters. And you're going to get that in New Mexico, right? He's going to make a stop here on Halloween. I guarantee you there's going to be a huge audience for him with a lot of very excited pro-Trump voters in New Mexico. And the flip side of that is he's going to have a lot of folks that are going to show up to protest. He thrives on that. I think that's what he wants to showcase to his base. He perceives that might turn out voters in other states that he's not visiting. And the key backdrop is immigration. Right, as a battleground state here in New Mexico where immigration is an important contextual point, I think he wants to get out here. I would anticipate him saying a lot about immigrants and immigration on his time in the mic here in New Mexico. And he probably perceives not only is that going to turn out more voters here in New Mexico, but in other western states and other battleground areas where he needs that to show up in higher force like Arizona. I think he perceives, right, pushing that issue here in the state's going to give him the backdrop that he's looking for. So, the other strategy side of this is he might be looking at his own internal numbers and seeing it differently than the rest of us are. He's always said New Mexico is a state that he perceives is in play for him. He said that back in 2019 when he made his visit before the 2020 race. So Republicans out there have to be looking at it and say, I know Sanchez and others are saying, Democrats have a pretty safe reality at the presidential race, but former President Trump sees it differently, and he's going to invest time here. They've all got to perceive that must mean that there's got to be a greater chance for not only him to win New Mexico, but some of the other down ballot candidates on the Republican side. So that's the context in which we should approach thinking about former President Trump investing valuable time in the state of New Mexico right before Election Day. He's got to be seeing things a little bit differently than the rest of us are.
The Harris campaign, Governor Walz was out in Gallup over the weekend, that the weekend before we're recording this here, but really there has not been much more of a presence from the Harris campaign. If you want to look a little bit deeper into that, you could say that over the last year, a lot of Biden administration officials have been here talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's kind of a quasi-campaign stop. Why is it that the Harris campaign, you feel like, has not spent much time here? Outright.
Yeah, the Harris campaign is definitely following what I would refer to as more traditional down the stretch, campaign efforts where you're focusing most of your time, at least with Harris as the top of the ticket and the most powerful surrogates, the Obamas, for example, are spending a lot more time in the key battleground states that are going to be divided by thousands of votes, right? That's where they're going to spend the most of their time. They're not going to be hitting New Mexico because they're looking at the polling numbers, they're looking at the underlying demographics and feel like they've got a pretty comfortable lead in New Mexico. So I would not anticipate them spending a lot of time in New Mexico, even attempting to counter a Trump visit. I think they're just playing more traditional strategy and investing their time, in states that they perceive are much more competitive. Will that backfire on them? That's definitely a possibility. You know what I mean? If it's a tighter race, then all the polling is suggesting a state like New Mexico becomes valuable. And the one thing I will say about former President Trump and Republicans' opportunities in this election cycle, they've got to be looking at it like, hey, in 2020, most of the pollsters got it wrong, right? They had a very bigger outperformance of polling than you would expect. So they've got to be looking at it like, hey, we're right where we want to be, right? We're within the margin of error in most polls, and they've got to anticipate that they're going to outperform some of those polls, including here in New Mexico, right? The flip side of that is Democrats look at polling and say, hey, we outperformed all the 2022 numbers. I mean, it seems like light years ago. It's only been 2 years, right? But so much has happened in politics. We've got to remind ourselves that most political experts were anticipating a huge, right, blue wave, not really materializing in a red wave in 2022. And that didn't happen. And that was all because polls, right, basically got wrong how strong Democrats would perform in 2022. So both sides have something to look forward to, right? Both sides have something to say, hey, I know the polls are saying X, but hey, we've seen polls get it wrong for our side. And I think that's important context to give everybody something to look forward to on Election Day, regardless of what the polls are talking about.
I want to ask a forward-looking question about the New Mexico federal delegation. There's certainly been stories over the last few years about a low level of population growth in this state. And we know that the population matters when it comes to who and how many representatives you have in Congress. Research from UNM suggests, a report just published earlier this year, suggested that the state will see a relatively flat population until 2035 and then possibly a decline attributed to a growing elderly population and a declining birth rate, among other things. What's the chance you feel like New Mexico may lose a congressional seat in the next round of census polling and redistricting?
Yeah, that's a scary proposition for New Mexicans to all think about, regardless if you're Democrat, Republican, or independent, right? Looking at the underlying census numbers is critical because our population numbers, right, not only impact whether or not we'll maintain the same number of seats, scary thing, potentially lose a representative, but it also impacts the underlying base of numbers we talk about for redistricting purposes, right? And we're talking a lot about the implications of redistricting on these election outcomes. So I think all of us need to pay close attention to that. You know, will we lose a seat in the next round of redistricting? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen this fast. But if we don't see a shift in our underlying demographics, which point to an aging population, most folks aren't really conscious of this, but New Mexico's one of the oldest in terms of median age demographics across the country already, and really trending towards an older segment of the population moving forward. That's driven a lot by, unfortunately, a lot of our young people leaving the state because they don't see the economic future for themselves. Their career opportunities may be looking brighter in other states, and that's really fueling a lot of the underlying demographic trends that we see. So I don't see this happening in the next round of redistricting. But as you noted, I think that report from Bieber indicated that we're talking about maybe out into 2038, into the 2040 season. I could definitely see us losing a seat as we put out that far into advance. And that means fewer representatives pushing for resources to come back to the state and a lot of other really important things that are not positive for New Mexicans. So let's hope our demographics shift, but everything's really suggesting, unfortunately, that we're going to see potentially a loss of seat down the line. I just don't see it happening as quickly as a next redistricting cycle.
Let's jump into the state legislature. All 112 seats are up for grabs. This is the first time the House and Senate will face new voting maps and redistricting. So let's start with the House. Should we expect any sort of shakeup in Democratic control there?
Yeah, I mean, important context for folks paying attention out there. Democrats have a pretty safe, right, overall standing in the legislature. Really important context for us to think about of just how difficult the landscape has been for Republican candidates. It's been a while since we've talked about a Republican winning a statewide office in the state of New Mexico. So you've got all that context that suggests, right, a pretty big night for Democrats. I think there's some interesting races that we can talk about, but I don't really see Republicans making up huge ground in the legislature. Democrats probably feel pretty comfortable with where they're at. But keep in mind, right, if we do see, like we saw in 2022, where nationally, right, Democrats outperformed what everybody was expecting. If we see Republicans doing the same now, there could be some interesting down the ballot context that could make for a bigger night for Republicans than we're expecting. I don't see anything in here that suggests that's going to happen. But hey, right, this is New Mexico politics where anything could happen. I could see Republicans picking up a few seats here and there that we're not really seeing right now being competitive for them.
One bit of context I should note going into this election, the House 70 seats total in New Mexico. Of those 70 seats, 38 of them are uncontested. That's 22 Democrats, 16 Republicans. So Democrats already have quite a bit of an edge just with uncontested races. Let's talk about those, some of the big hot button races that have popped up this cycle, where maybe you'll see a flip. I know one of them we were talking about right before we started recording was Rebecca Dow, Republican, who ran for governor, was hoping to retain her seat, or I'm sorry, win back a seat, I should say, in the state legislature. That's in District 38. The district also shifted quite a bit, right? It now ropes in, I think, parts of it's a change between Socorro, Truth or Consequences, and I want to say the Silver City kind of southwest area, but a big shift in redistricting, the amount of voters that they cover, which voters they cover.
Yeah, you're spot on, Chris. I mean, this is one of the handful of races I'll be paying close attention to, not just because in and of itself, it's an interesting race. A lot of money's been invested in it. I think this is a seat that Republicans feel that they can flip back. It's been a pretty comfortable seat for Republicans for some time. Redistricting changed that, right? It made it a bit more Democratic leaning. With Dow vacating her seat to make a run at governor, Democrats were able to pick up the seat. An important context for viewers is when either side is looking to pick up seats, what they're often looking for is an incumbent who hasn't been in office very long, right? If Democrats only have this seat for one cycle, that doesn't really give the Democrat a long period of time to build up that huge incumbency advantage that we know is reality in politics. So they see this as one, hey, Democrats won it, back in 2022, but we know it's viable, and Dow's back in the mix. And candidate Dow's got name recognition. She's obviously made a run for governor. She can raise money. She's got all of those advantages. She knows the district very well. Voters in the district know her. So I think this is one where I do see Republicans, if they have a decent night, this is a seat that they should actually flip. And you think about, incumbent Jaramillo, not been in office that long, again, hasn't really built up the huge name recognition value that you see that comes with the overall incumbency advantage. And let's look at the amount of money, right, that is racked up. We're talking about almost $500,000 in financial contributions for a House race, right? Just tells you how much money has been invested in the district. And I think that speaks to this being one of the key races that we'll want to pay close attention to, that I do think Dow has a good chance at being able to pick back up for Republicans.
Yeah, I just wanted to correct myself here. The boundary before redistricting, it stretched out west. From the Truth or Consequences Elephant Butte area out west towards Silver City. It now stretches up north towards Socorro. So a big shift in those House district boundaries for District 38. Tara Jaramillo, the Democrat, facing Rebecca Dow.
And just last thing to point out, in this district, I think, I was asked like, hey, give me one word on what this overall election season in New Mexico feels like, and I think I said contentious. This is a contentious race, right? You've had a cease and desist letter delivered to Dow by Jaramillo. You've had accusations from the Dow side in their campaign ads that Jaramillo has misspent state funds in the past. So this is a contentious race. This has gotten personal, right? That's part of the reason why it's a juicy race for us to unpack, is it's not just competitive, right? You've got candidates that have dug in and done mudslinging on both sides of this, and I would anticipate that getting even a little bit more nasty down the home stretch of the campaign before we see Election Day.
What about the Senate? The story there points to far more open seats this election. Again, Democrats have controlled this chamber for a long time. Any shakeups you're looking at there?
Senate, again, for Democrats, they've got to feel good going into this race. There's not a whole lot of opportunities that I see for Republicans to make up ground, and they'd have to make up a lot of ground to be more balanced, right, and not have Democrats have the advantage that they've had in recent memory.
Right. I'll give 27 Democrats to 15 Republicans.
Yeah, 27 to 15, 12, right? That doesn't seem huge, but in terms of being able to hold power, Republicans are having a difficult time in the Senate being able to do that with just a 12 seat disadvantage. I'll give you one that I'll pay attention to, and that's Senate District 12. This is another one impacted by redistricting. And remember, this is Gerald Ortiz-Pino's seat that he vacated, right? So this is an opportunity where I think there could be some interesting context and an opportunity for Republicans to pick up a seat on the Senate side. You've got Jay Block on the Republican side, a very well-known Rio Rancho Republican, was run for governor himself, has name recognition, has the opportunity to raise money. You've got all of that going for, thinking about Block as a candidate to be able to pick up a potential seat against a little less known Democrat and Philip Ramirez for an open seat. So anytime you've got an open seat, that's one we pay attention to because nobody's got incumbency advantage, right? And block with name recognition and all that. This is one where I think if Republicans have a little bit better, overall showing than we're expecting, this could be one of the few Senate opportunities for them to pick up a seat.
Yeah, certainly quite a bit of open seats here. I counted up on my list. There's at least, I believe it's 10 or close, 9 or 10 open seats that have reshaped from redistricting. And that District 12 one is really weird because of the fact that it used to cover downtown Albuquerque, and then they basically drew in the other surrounding districts to gobble that up and create a new one in the Rio Rancho area. So 12 will go from, downtown Albuquerque to now parts of Rio Rancho.
And it makes it a little bit more competitive for Republicans, right? And I mean, one of the things you always look at is if somebody vacates a political seat, right, especially after redistricting, it usually tells them they perceive it's going to be a harder road to maintain the seat. And I think that's part of the context that makes this a little bit more interesting for a potential Republican pickup is through the redistricting rounds, as you noted, picking up a bit more Rio Rancho. That's a little bit more conservative area of the Albuquerque metro, broader area. So I think it definitely gives Republicans an opportunity to pick one of these up. And again, all they have to do is have a little bit better showing than what we're anticipating for that to be viable for them.
Looking a little more broader and long term, what do you make of the speculation that, Governor Michelle Luhan Grisham could possibly depart as governor if a Harris administration takes shape?
I've spent a lot of time talking about the Luhan Grisham administration. And unfortunately for her, it seems as though she's following a lot of the trends we've seen with past New Mexico governors, where the second term in office, approval ratings start to drop a little bit more difficulty, even making things happen within her own party. A lot of this is what we've seen in recent memory for New Mexico governors. And because of that context and her close connections to Vice President Harris, a lot of us have speculated this might be, an opportunity for her to be able to take something on the national stage. Again, nothing new for what we've talked about from prior New Mexico governors. We talked about that in the context of former Governor Martinez, former Governor Richardson. Our governors have played a pretty big role in national politics. And I think that bodes well for New Mexicans, thinking about the pride we have of some of our, local elected officials, our governors being able to have opportunities on the big national stage. And I think there's a big opportunity for Governor Luhan Grisham, assuming, obviously, Harris wins. Harris doesn't win, right? It's a much different reality for her. She's been a big thorn in the side of former President Trump and all of that context. But if Harris wins, I do anticipate she'll have a lot of opportunities. Whether or not she takes advantage of those and vacates the governorship to do that, only she knows the answer to that. But given that context, right, it's not that fun to be a New Mexico governor in your second term. It just hasn't been in the past, and I don't look forward to seeing her have a lot of opportunity to make a lot of noise with the last couple of years that she would have as New Mexico governor. So Harris wins, I definitely would anticipate that she's going to get opportunities, and I would probably speculate she'll probably take one of those rather than sticking it out and writing it out her last term in office, where again we're seeing her approval ratings dip pretty considerably. That is a powerful thing for us to look at, because as governors in New Mexico see their approval ratings start to drop a bit, that means they might just not have the power and influence to push forward the policies that they care about. And I think as a governor, you probably look at it and say, I might have more fun and more impact at the federal level. And I think that's probably what we would handicap that likelihood for her, just where we stand now. Obviously, Harris has to win to make that a reality.
Yeah, and I want to dig a little bit deeper into what you were talking about. Of course, if Governor Luhan Grisham doesn't get a cabinet appointment either by Trump victory or maybe Harris just passes her over, how do you see the governor's future playing out in New Mexico? And I think the important context in here is just a few months ago, there was a special session on crime, right, where she rallied everybody to do something now to pass these crime bills that she had put forward, and it was a resounding no from the legislature, right? There was quite a bit of resistance toward those ideas, and so much so that it some would say it looked embarrassing for the governor, right? People within her own party were saying, this is not the time for these ideas, but thanks, but no thanks. Point is, what do you see as the governor's future after a pretty mediocre special session where I think the legislature said, we have, just a reminder, we have a lot of power in this government?
Yeah, I mean, that that tricky balance of power is always interesting for us to follow, especially when we're talking about in-party dynamics, right? You would anticipate the governor have a difficult time bringing Republicans to the table because she doesn't have really the power and influence that you do when you come in on your first term. And so I would expect that. What's not as expected is for Democrats to make it difficult for her to advance some of those initiatives, which obviously all of us said that special session was not something to highlight as a big, powerful thing to promote if you're the governor, right? It was a little bit of difficult context for her. You saw a lot of leadership within the Democratic Party essentially say, you know what, we're not really there for you on this particular set of issues. And I think the important context is all voters in New Mexico want to see something done on crime. So the fact that the governor was not able to really make that happen, I think was telling, and obviously telling is the fact that every poll that has come out relatively recently with her approval numbers show she's kind of at the lowest point, of her reign in New Mexico politics. And again, that's the same trends we saw with former Governor Richardson. That's the same trends we saw with former Governor Martinez. Our governors have had a difficult time maintaining that level of influence and that level of overall power, even within their party, as they get closer to the end of their run in 2 terms of administration. And I think Governor Luhan Grisham is feeling those same forces that our past governors have felt. And for her, I think what that means is not a lot of opportunity for her to make a lot of headway on some of the issues that, are important to her and that she's campaigned on over the years. That's somewhat also for New Mexicans out there. You look at it and you say, well, hey, there's a lot that needs to happen, right? Crime, clean energy, a big major issue that the governor has made a priority for her. So obviously, if Harris does not win, I don't see a whole lot of opportunities for the governor to make big things happen down the stretch where eventually, right, we start to transition to calling her a lame duck like we've done with the past governors, where a lot of folks are already looking to the future. And, obviously a governor, you're limited in how many years you have to govern, and folks will start to think about, as we were already talking about on this show, what the future looks like for our governorship. And she's obviously not going to be part of that.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
Anything else that you want to mention or think is important to talk about ahead of election? It is election day if you're listening to this on the day that this episode drops. But anything else we're missing, Gabe?
The thing that I'm paying attention to is obviously we've talked a lot about Democratic advantage in the state. We spent on this podcast talking about the underlying demographics, redistricting, right? The overall national wins may be trending a little bit more to Democrats in the state. So if I'm the Republican Party, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, look, we need some new fresh faces, right? We've talked a lot about the Republican Party not really having those candidates that can galvanize statewide Republican voters and pick up a lot of moderate Democrats to make Republicans more competitive in the state. So I'd look at this race to see, are there any up-and-comers, maybe down ballot Republicans that overcome some of these overall barriers that Republicans have. Will we see somebody really become a potential shining star on the Republican side that can eventually become the statewide figure that I think the Republican Party is desperately looking for, that can be the show person, if you want to think about it, for their party moving forward. So that's something to look at. Will a Domenici outpace former President Trump on the ballot and make herself look a little bit more attractive to the Republican Party moving forward? Will one of these congressional district candidates, outperform what polling has suggested they would potentially do? Not necessarily winning, but outperforming polls to give themselves, right, the opportunity to say, give me another shot in 2 or 4 years. I think that's something to look forward to because the Republican Party obviously needs some fresh faces to be able to be more competitive statewide.
Yeah, there's certainly some names of note here. When I just look at the Senate races, Audrey Trujillo, she ran for Secretary of State before. Kirsten Johnson, that is as well. She has run for the House before. Ant Thornton, he has run in previous elections, I believe, as the Lieutenant Governor. He ran, and then Gabriel Ramos, who's running as a Republican in Silver City area, actually was appointed to the seat to fill Howie Morales' seat after he won the Lieutenant Governorship. And Gabriel Ramos is now running as a Republican, having actually been a Democrat, identified as a Democrat in the past. So there are certainly some names in here of returning folks. And to your point, I think we'll see if they turn into people who get another shot, depending on what happens here.
Let's see if one of these folks can seize the opportunity and make something of it, right? We always have to remind ourselves, right, like before somebody can jump on the stage and say, I'm running for Senate at the U.S. side federally, or I'm running for governor. They've got to earn their keep, so to speak, by winning or outperforming what we all expect them to do on some of these lower level races. And I think if one of these Republicans can seize the opportunity, right, they could be the next Susana Martinez, right? They can be the next person from the Republican side that makes a lot of headway. And I think that's what the Republican Party is looking for.
Well, Gabe Sanchez, thank you so much for joining us. We always appreciate your analysis.
I always appreciate the opportunity to come and talk a little New Mexico politics. It'll be an exciting and an interesting election season, as it always is here in the state of New Mexico.
Thank you, sir. Again, a big thanks to KRQE political analyst Gabe Sanchez for joining us. Hopefully gave you a good breakdown of what we're paying attention to on the federal and state races. We should also note that if you're watching this on Fox New Mexico, this has been an abbreviated conversation for the entire conversation. Go to our YouTube page, our KRQE YouTube page, or krqe.com/podcast.
Yeah, and if you're watching on Election Day, go out and vote. Make your vote count. The polls close at 7 p.m. Stay with KRQE on air and online for all of your local election results. We will keep you posted. And in the meantime, if you have any story ideas or anyone you'd like to hear from on our show, feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media.
I'm at Chris McKee TV and also Chris.McKee@krqe.com. Thanks for watching and listening.